Rebecca Martinez was 38 years old, a registered nurse from Seattle, and until 6 months ago, she thought she understood the boundaries of human cruelty. She was wrong. The woman she had called Mom for 7 years, the woman who had welcomed her into the family with open arms and homemade pot roast, had been systematically poisoning her every single day under the guise of providing essential vitamins. When Rebecca finally had those innocent-looking capsules tested at a toxicology laboratory, the results weren't just shocking, they were criminal evidence of attempted murder. What she did next didn't just save her life, it exposed a conspiracy that had been hiding in plain sight for years. And the justice that followed was more complete than anyone could have imagined. Rebecca met Daniel Harris 7 years earlier at Seattle General Hospital, where she worked in the cardiac intensive care unit. He had rushed in with his father, who was experiencing severe chest pains, his face pale with worry, his hands shaking as he filled out the admission paperwork. While his father's condition turned out to be a panic attack rather than a heart attack, Rebecca remembered being struck by Daniel's attentiveness throughout the ordeal. He held his father's hand during the examination, asked detailed questions about every medication, took meticulous notes about follow-up care, and thanked every nurse and doctor personally. He was 35 then, an architect with his own small firm, specializing in sustainable residential design, and he had warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled with genuine relief, after learning his father would be fine. After his father was discharged, Daniel returned to the hospital the next day carrying 2 cups of expensive coffee and a nervous smile. He found Rebecca during her break and asked if she would consider having dinner with him sometime. Rebecca normally maintained strict boundaries about dating people she met through work, but something about Daniel felt different. He seemed safe, solid, dependable in a way that was increasingly rare in her dating experiences. She said yes, and they exchanged numbers right there in the hospital cafeteria, while her colleagues watched with amused expressions. Their first date was at Pike Place Market on a sunny Saturday afternoon in May. They spent 4 hours wandering through the crowded stalls, sampling artisan cheeses and fresh, baked bread, watching the famous fish throwers launch salmon through the air, and talking about everything from their childhoods to their dreams for the future. Daniel told her about growing up in a close-knit family in Queen Anne, how his mother Patricia had essentially raised him and his younger sister alone, after his father became permanently disabled from a construction accident when Daniel was 12 years old. He spoke about his mother with deep reverence, calling her his hero, saying she had sacrificed her own dreams of becoming a principal to work double shifts as a teacher to keep the family fed and housed. Rebecca found his devotion endearing. It showed character, depth, the kind of family values she wanted in a partner, after a string of relationships with emotionally unavailable men. Their courtship progressed quickly, but thoughtfully over the next several months. Daniel took her to concerts at the Paramount Theatre, to dinners at hidden gem restaurants in Capitol Hill, to weekend hikes in the Cascades, where they talked for hours about their hopes and fears. He was romantic without being overwhelming, attentive without being suffocating, and he made her laugh with his dry humor and silly architectural puns. Rebecca felt herself falling in love for the first time in years, maybe for the first time ever in this complete, whole-hearted way. Daniel introduced Rebecca to his mother Patricia after they had been dating for 2 months. Patricia Harris lived in a meticulously maintained craftsman home in Queen Anne, the same house where Daniel had grown up, filled with antique furniture and family photographs in silver frames. Patricia was 58 then, a recently retired elementary school teacher with perfectly styled silver hair that she had done at the same salon every week for 30 years. Impeccable fashion sense that leaned toward classic blazers and pearl necklaces, and an intimidating way of making guests feel both welcomed and subtly judged simultaneously. That first dinner, Patricia had prepared an elaborate pot roast with roasted root vegetables, homemade rolls, and a cherry pie that was apparently Daniel's childhood favorite. She asked Rebecca hundreds of questions about her family background, her nursing career, her religious beliefs, her financial situation, and her long-term intentions with Daniel. Rebecca remembered Daniel squeezing her hand under the polished mahogany table, giving her encouraging looks and mouthing silent apologies when his mother's questions became particularly intrusive. Rebecca tried desperately to make a good impression, answering every question thoroughly and respectfully despite feeling like she was undergoing a job interview rather than a family dinner. When they left that evening, Daniel assured Rebecca that the interrogation meant his mother cared, that Patricia had texted him immediately after they left saying Rebecca was absolutely perfect and exactly what Daniel needed. Rebecca chose to believe this despite the cold feeling in her stomach that suggested Patricia's smile hadn't quite reached her pale blue eyes. Over the following months, Patricia became a regular presence in their relationship. She would call Daniel multiple times daily, drop by his apartment unannounced with food she had cooked, and frequently invite them for Sunday dinners that felt more mandatory than optional. Daniel saw nothing unusual in this level of involvement. He had been raised by a single mother, who had made him the center of her universe, and he genuinely couldn't understand why someone would want distance from their parent. The wedding took place 18 months after their first date, a beautiful September ceremony at a historic mansion overlooking Puget Sound, with 200 guests in attendance. Patricia had insisted on planning most of the event despite Rebecca's mother flying in from Phoenix hoping to be involved. Patricia chose the florist, selected the menu, arranged the seating chart, hired the photographer, and even suggested significant modifications to Rebecca's wedding dress that her personal seamstress could make to be more flattering and appropriate. Rebecca's mother, a quiet woman named Margaret, who worked as a librarian, felt increasingly sidelined during the planning process, but advised Rebecca to pick her battles carefully, saying some mother-in-laws simply needed to feel important and involved. The wedding day itself was objectively beautiful with white roses and candlelight everywhere. Patricia gave an emotional toast that made most guests cry, talking about how she was gaining the daughter she had always wanted, how she had prayed for years that Daniel would find someone truly worthy of him, and how she just knew Rebecca would take care of her precious boy the way he deserved. Rebecca felt genuinely moved standing there in her modified dress, holding Daniel's hand, thinking she had found not just a husband, but a second family who would love and support her. The first 3 years of marriage were happy overall, despite some underlying tensions Rebecca occasionally felt but couldn't quite articulate. She and Daniel purchased a modern condo in Fremont, close enough to Patricia's house to visit easily, but far enough to maintain some independence. They both worked demanding schedules, Rebecca pulling 12-hour shifts at the hospital and Daniel often working late on project deadlines, but they prioritized their relationship. They took weekend trips to the San Juan Islands, hosted dinner parties for their friends, and discussed their plans for starting a family in the near future. Patricia remained deeply involved in their lives in ways that sometimes felt excessive, but that Daniel considered completely normal. She had a key to their condo for emergencies. She would let herself in to clean or drop off food when they were at work. She expected them for Sunday dinner every single week without exception, and she called Daniel at least 3 times daily to discuss everything from her grocery shopping to her opinions about current events. Rebecca initially tried to set gentle boundaries, suggesting they might skip some Sunday dinners or asking Daniel to let his mother know when they would be home, so she wouldn't let herself into an empty apartment. Daniel reacted to these suggestions with genuine confusion and hurt, asking why Rebecca would want to exclude his mother, who only wanted to help them and show her love. He reminded Rebecca that Patricia had sacrificed everything for him, that she was alone now with his father essentially bedridden in a nursing facility, and that family was supposed to take care of each other. Rebecca backed down each time, not wanting to be the stereotypical wife who came between a man and his mother, not wanting to seem ungrateful for all of Patricia's generosity and support. Looking back later, Rebecca would recognize this as her first major mistake. The moment when she should have insisted on boundaries, regardless of how it made her appear. Everything shifted dramatically about 18 months before the poisoning was discovered. Rebecca was 36 years old, and her gynecologist had advised her not to wait much longer if she and Daniel wanted children, given that fertility declines significantly after 35. They had been casually trying for about a year without success, but now they got serious about it. Rebecca began tracking her cycles with apps and ovulation kits, taking prenatal vitamins and folic acid supplements, cutting out alcohol completely, and scheduling her work shifts around her most fertile days. Daniel was equally committed, attending all her doctor appointments and researching everything about optimizing male fertility. When they told Patricia about their intensified efforts to conceive, she was absolutely thrilled in a way that felt almost overwhelming. She talked constantly about the grandchildren she would help raise, about the nursery she was already planning in her guest bedroom, about the family traditions she would pass down, about how this baby would be the most loved child in the world. But around this same time, Rebecca began noticing subtle changes in how Patricia treated her. The compliments became backhanded observations about how tired Rebecca looked, how she seemed to be gaining weight around her middle, how the stress of her job was probably affecting her health. Patricia would make pointed comments about Rebecca's diet, suggesting she ate too much processed food and not enough home-cooked meals, questioning whether Rebecca was really doing everything possible to prepare her body for pregnancy. She began sending Daniel articles about women who worked too much to conceive successfully, about how some women's careers prevented them from becoming mothers, about how nursing was particularly stressful and demanding. Daniel would show Rebecca these articles with concern, asking if she had considered cutting back her hours or taking a less demanding position. Rebecca felt increasingly criticized and inadequate. But Daniel insisted his mother's comments came from a place of genuine concern and love. The first real red flag appeared about 14 months ago, during one of the mandatory Sunday dinners at Patricia's house. Patricia had prepared an elaborate Italian feast that had apparently taken her all day to cook. The meal was delicious as always, but halfway through her second helping of lasagna, Rebecca felt an intense wave of nausea, unlike anything she had experienced before. Her stomach cramped violently, her mouth filled with saliva, and she barely made it to the bathroom before vomiting so forcefully that she burst blood vessels around her eyes. Patricia appeared at the bathroom door within seconds, all maternal concern and soothing words, saying Rebecca must have caught a stomach virus from one of her patients at the hospital, that healthcare workers were constantly exposed to infections, that Rebecca needed to be more careful about hygiene and hand washing. Patricia made Rebecca chamomile tea with honey, insisted she lie down on the leather couch in the living room, and sent Daniel to the pharmacy to buy anti-nausea medication and electrolyte drinks. Rebecca felt so violently ill that she ended up staying at Patricia's house that night in Daniel's old childhood bedroom, with its football trophies and high school photos still on the walls. By morning, she felt mostly recovered and went home assuming Patricia had been right about a random stomach bug. But the same thing happened again 3 weeks later, and then twice more over the following month, always during or shortly after eating at Patricia's house. Rebecca began to dread Sunday dinners, and she suggested to Daniel that maybe they could skip a few weeks, or that Patricia could come to their place instead. Daniel looked hurt and confused, asking why Rebecca didn't enjoy spending time with his mother, reminding her that Patricia went to so much trouble to cook these elaborate meals because she loved them. Rebecca felt guilty and stopped complaining, but she started eating smaller portions at Patricia's house and bringing snacks to eat before and after to avoid seeming rude. The vitamin regimen began about a year ago during a conversation about Rebecca's continued failure to get pregnant. They were at Patricia's house for Sunday dinner, and Rebecca mentioned casually that her doctor had suggested she might want to try acupuncture or see a fertility specialist if they didn't conceive within the next few months. Patricia's face had gone through several expressions, first concern, then thoughtfulness, then excitement, as if she had just remembered something important. She disappeared into her bedroom and returned carrying a large decorative tin, filled with various bottles of supplements and vitamins. Patricia explained that when she had been trying to conceive Daniel years ago, she had struggled for almost 2 years before a naturopathic doctor had put her on a specific regimen of vitamins and herbs that resulted in pregnancy within 3 months. She had saved all the supplements, she said, knowing that someday her future daughter-in-law might need them. Patricia pulled out a bottle of capsules that looked professional and pharmaceutical, with a typed label that read, "Fertility Blend, Women's Formula." She explained that these were custom, made by a naturopathic pharmacy in Vancouver that specialized in reproductive health, that they contained a proprietary blend of herbs and vitamins, specifically designed to regulate hormones and support conception. The bottle was sealed and looked legitimate, and Patricia was so earnest and enthusiastic that Rebecca felt touched by the gesture. Patricia insisted that Rebecca take 1 capsule every single morning with breakfast. That consistency was absolutely crucial for the supplements to work properly, and that she should continue taking them until she got a positive pregnancy test. Rebecca agreed, thanking Patricia profusely for thinking of her, and for being so generous with something that had obviously worked for Patricia herself. Rebecca started taking the vitamins the very next morning. The capsules were large and dark green, and they had a slightly bitter herbal smell when she opened the bottle, but they went down easily enough with orange juice. Patricia called that afternoon to make sure Rebecca had started the regimen, emphasizing again how important it was to take them at the same time every single day, without missing even 1 dose. Over the following weeks, Patricia became obsessive about the vitamins, asking every time she saw or spoke to Rebecca whether she was being consistent with them, whether she was taking them on an empty stomach or with food, whether she was storing them properly away from heat and light. About 2 weeks after starting the vitamins, Rebecca began feeling persistently unwell in ways that were hard to describe. She felt constantly fatigued, no matter how much she slept. Her joints ached in a way that reminded her of having the flu, and she developed frequent headaches that throbbed behind her eyes. She assumed at first that she was fighting off some infection from the hospital, but the symptoms persisted week after week without ever developing into a full illness. She found herself needing to sit down frequently during her shifts, feeling dizzy and weak in a way that was completely unlike her normally high energy levels. Her colleagues commented that she looked pale and asked if she was feeling all right, and her nurse manager suggested she take a few sick days to recover from whatever was making her so run down. Rebecca mentioned these symptoms to Patricia during one of their increasingly frequent phone conversations, and Patricia immediately suggested that the fatigue and aches were probably positive signs that the vitamins were working, that Rebecca's body was detoxifying and rebalancing hormonally, that she might even already be pregnant and experiencing early pregnancy symptoms. This explanation made sense to Rebecca, and it gave her hope that the vitamins might actually be helping despite how awful she felt. Daniel was thrilled at the possibility that she might be pregnant, and he became even more solicitous and protective, insisting she rest more and work less. But instead of getting better, Rebecca's symptoms steadily worsened over the following months. She developed a tremor in her hands that made starting IVs difficult at work. She lost 15 pounds despite eating normally because she had constant nausea, and her hair began falling out in alarming amounts every time she showered or brushed it. She saw her doctor multiple times for blood work and examinations, but everything came back relatively normal, except for some slight anemia that her doctor attributed to her heavy menstrual periods. Her doctor suggested she was probably experiencing stress and recommended she consider therapy or meditation, or possibly a leave of absence from work. Throughout all of this, Patricia became increasingly present in their lives in ways that felt suffocating, but that Daniel encouraged. She insisted on coming to their condo 3 or 4 times a week to cook dinner and clean, because Rebecca was too tired to manage the household properly. She would let herself in while they were at work and reorganize their kitchen cabinets, wash their laundry, and go through their mail. Rebecca would come home to find Patricia had been there, and while part of her appreciated the help, given how exhausted she felt, another part felt violated and overwhelmed by the constant intrusion. When Rebecca tried to talk to Daniel about needing more space and privacy, he got genuinely angry for the first time in their marriage, saying his mother was sacrificing her time and energy to help them, because Rebecca was too sick to take care of her own home, and that Rebecca was being ungrateful and cruel to reject such selfless love. The poisoning intensified around 5 months ago, when Patricia suggested that Rebecca might need a stronger dose of the fertility vitamins, since they hadn't resulted in pregnancy yet. Patricia produced a new bottle of capsules that looked identical to the first, but were labeled Fertility Blend, Maximum Strength Formula. She explained that the naturopathic pharmacy had developed this stronger version for women with particularly stubborn fertility issues, and that Rebecca should now take 2 capsules every morning instead of 1. Rebecca was desperate at this point, feeling like a failure as a wife for not being able to give Daniel the children he wanted, and she agreed immediately to double the dose. Within a week of increasing the dosage, Rebecca's condition deteriorated dramatically. She could barely get out of bed most mornings. Her entire body ached, as if she had been beaten, and she developed severe cognitive difficulties that terrified her. She would forget words in the middle of sentences, lose track of what she was doing while performing simple tasks, and find herself staring at her computer screen at work, unable to remember what she was supposed to be documenting. Her hands shook so badly that she couldn't safely administer medications, and her nurse manager finally insisted she go on immediate medical leave until she figured out what was wrong with her health. Rebecca saw multiple specialists over the following weeks, including a neurologist, a rheumatologist, an endocrinologist, and an infectious disease doctor, but nobody could identify what was causing her symptoms. She had MRIs, more extensive blood work, thyroid testing, autoimmune panels, and even a spinal tap, but every test came back either normal or only slightly abnormal, in ways that didn't explain her profound illness. The neurologist suggested she might be developing multiple sclerosis or early onset Parkinson's disease, but the tests for those conditions were inconclusive. The rheumatologist thought she might have lupus or fibromyalgia, but again, the diagnostic criteria weren't quite met. Several doctors suggested that her symptoms might be psychosomatic, that stress and depression could manifest as very real physical symptoms, and that she should consider seeing a psychiatrist and starting antidepressants. Throughout this medical nightmare, Patricia was constantly present, accompanying Rebecca to appointments, taking notes, asking questions, and presenting herself as a concerned mother figure. She would sit in the examination rooms, holding Rebecca's hand, wiping away Rebecca's tears when doctors suggested there was nothing physically wrong, and insisting to Daniel that Rebecca needed even more support and care at home. Patricia began staying overnight at their condo several nights a week, sleeping in their guest room, and taking over more and more of the household responsibilities, while Rebecca lay in bed, feeling like her body was shutting down piece by piece. Patricia would bring Rebecca meals in bed, encourage her to eat even when Rebecca had no appetite, and make sure Rebecca took her vitamins every single morning without fail. The discovery happened completely by accident 4 months ago, during one of Rebecca's increasingly rare lucid moments. She was lying in bed, trying to summon the energy to get up, watching Patricia bustle around the bedroom organizing things, when Patricia's purse fell off the dresser and spilled its contents across the floor. Patricia rushed to gather everything, but Rebecca saw something that made her brain suddenly snap into focus. There was a nearly identical vitamin bottle to the one Rebecca took every morning, but the label was completely different. Rebecca could only see it for a second before Patricia snatched it up, but the label had definitely said something different. Something that looked like a pharmaceutical name rather than a naturopathic formula. Rebecca's nursing training kicked in despite her cognitive fog, and a terrible possibility began forming in her mind. She waited until Patricia left the room, then forced herself out of bed and went to the bathroom where she kept her vitamin bottle. She examined it closely for the first time in months, really looking at it rather than just opening it routinely every morning. The label looked professional, but something about it seemed off. The printing quality was good but not pharmaceutical, grade perfect, and there was no lot number or expiration date, which was unusual even for supplements. More importantly, there was no actual ingredient list, just the vague description of a proprietary blend. Rebecca's hands were shaking as she opened the bottle and examined the capsules themselves. They were two-tone gelatin capsules, dark green and white, and when she carefully pulled one apart, the powder inside was grayish, green, and had a distinctly chemical smell, rather than the herbal scent she had assumed. Something was very wrong. And Rebecca's instincts as a nurse were screaming at her, even through the fog of her illness. She took 3 of the capsules and hid them in a small Ziploc bag at the bottom of her purse, behind a hidden pocket, and then put the bottle back exactly where it had been. For the next 2 days, Rebecca pretended to take her vitamins as usual, but actually hid them instead, palming them, and later disposing of them. She told Patricia and Daniel that she was taking them normally, and she tried to act as sick as she had been so neither would suspect anything had changed. But within 48 hours of not taking the capsules, Rebecca noticed something remarkable. Her thinking began to clear slightly, the fog lifting just enough that she could form complete thoughts and follow conversations better. Her hands didn't shake quite as badly, and she had enough energy to sit up in bed for longer periods. She knew this could be coincidence or wishful thinking, but every instinct told her it wasn't. Rebecca began researching toxicology labs in Seattle on her phone, trying to find one that would test unknown substances for private individuals without requiring a police report or doctor's order. It took several searches, but she finally found a private laboratory in the industrial district that did chemical analysis for various purposes, including identifying unknown substances. She called them from the bathroom, with the door locked and explained that she needed some capsules tested because she suspected they might contain something harmful. The lab technician said they could do a full analysis, including heavy metals screening, pharmaceutical identification, and toxin detection for $800 with results in 5 to 7 business days. Rebecca agreed immediately, using a credit card Patricia and Daniel didn't know about. She took an Uber to the lab the next day, while Patricia thought she was sleeping and Daniel was at work. The facility was sterile and professional, and the technician who met her was a serious woman in her 50s named Dr. Chen, who asked no unnecessary questions. Rebecca handed over the 3 capsules in their Ziploc bag and filled out paperwork using her maiden name and her mother's address in Phoenix for the results to be mailed. Dr. Chen explained that they would perform a comprehensive analysis, including mass spectrometry, gas chromatography, and heavy metal testing, and that the results would indicate exactly what compounds were present in the capsules and in what concentrations. The wait for results was agonizing. Rebecca continued pretending to take the vitamins, while actually disposing of them, and she continued to improve slightly each day, which both confirmed her suspicions and filled her with absolute horror about what had been done to her. She was careful not to improve too obviously, continuing to stay in bed most of the time and acting weak and confused when Patricia or Daniel were around. Patricia continued to be present constantly, asking multiple times daily whether Rebecca had taken her vitamins, emphasizing how important consistency was, especially now that Rebecca seemed to be struggling so much. The lab results arrived at her mother's house in Phoenix, exactly 7 days after submission. Rebecca called her mother and asked her to open the envelope immediately and read the results over the phone. What her mother read made Rebecca's blood run cold and simultaneously filled her with a strange sense of vindication that she hadn't been going crazy. The capsules contained a combination of substances that no legitimate fertility supplement would ever include. The primary active ingredient was thallium sulfate, a highly toxic heavy metal that had once been used as rat poison before being banned for that purpose. Due to its extreme danger, the capsules also contained significant amounts of arsenic trioxide, another classic poison, and smaller amounts of lithium carbonate and several benzodiazepines, including alprazolam and diazepam, in quantities sufficient to cause sedation and cognitive impairment. Rebecca sat on the bathroom floor, listening to her mother read these results, and everything suddenly made horrible sense. The tremors, the hair loss, the cognitive dysfunction, the extreme fatigue, the joint pain, the nausea, everything were all classic symptoms of heavy metal poisoning, particularly thallium poisoning. Patricia hadn't been trying to help her get pregnant. Patricia had been slowly poisoning her, probably trying to kill her in a way that would look like a tragic mystery illness that baffled doctors. And she had nearly succeeded. 6 months of daily poisoning had brought Rebecca to the edge of death, and if she had continued taking the capsules much longer, the damage to her nervous system and organs might have been permanent or fatal. Rebecca told her mother everything on that phone call, while sobbing. And her mother immediately said she was flying to Seattle the next day, and that they needed to go the police immediately with this evidence. But Rebecca knew she needed more than just 3 tested capsules to build a case that would actually result in Patricia being prosecuted. She needed to catch Patricia in the act, needed proof that Patricia was intentionally poisoning her, needed evidence that would be legally ironclad. Over the next week, while her mother stayed at a hotel and Rebecca pretended everything was normal, they formulated a plan. Rebecca contacted a lawyer who specialized in criminal cases involving domestic violence and poisoning, a sharp woman in her 50s named Catherine Morrison, who had successfully prosecuted several similar cases involving family members poisoning each other. Catherine's office was in downtown Seattle in a high-rise building, and Rebecca remembered feeling terrified walking into that first consultation, wondering if she was crazy for even suspecting something so horrible about her mother-in-law. But Catherine had seen cases like this before, she explained, and the pattern Rebecca described was unfortunately familiar to anyone who specialized in this area of criminal law. Catherine listened to Rebecca's entire story over the course of 2 hours, taking detailed notes on a yellow legal pad and asking specific questions about timelines, symptoms, and Patricia's behavior. She examined the lab results that Dr. Chen had provided, and her expression grew increasingly serious as she read the list of toxic substances found in the capsules. When Rebecca finished speaking, Catherine was silent for a long moment before looking up and saying that Rebecca's instincts had very likely saved her life. That the combination and quantities of poisons found in those capsules would have killed her within weeks if she had continued taking them, and that they needed to build an absolutely ironclad case before confronting Patricia or involving police. Catherine explained that poisoning cases were notoriously difficult to prosecute successfully because they required proof of intentional harm rather than accidental exposure or contamination, and because defense attorneys often successfully argued that the accused person had no knowledge of what was in the substances they provided, or that the victim was lying or mistaken about what they had consumed. They needed multiple forms of evidence that would work together to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Patricia had deliberately and repeatedly poisoned Rebecca with intent to cause death or serious bodily harm. 3 tested capsules, and Rebecca's testimony alone wouldn't be enough, no matter how compelling Rebecca found her own story. Catherine outlined a comprehensive evidence-gathering plan that would take at least several weeks to execute. First, Rebecca needed to have her blood and hair tested immediately by a forensic toxicology laboratory that Catherine used regularly for criminal cases, a facility that specialized in testing for poisoning and whose results would be admissible in court, with expert testimony from their toxicologists. The testing needed to show that Rebecca had elevated levels of the specific poisons found in the capsules, and ideally the hair analysis would show a timeline of exposure that corresponded to when Rebecca started taking the vitamins Patricia had provided. This would prove that Rebecca had actually been poisoned and hadn't just fabricated claims or tested capsules that she had tampered with herself. Second, Catherine advised installing hidden surveillance cameras in Rebecca's home, particularly in areas where Patricia spent time alone, such as the kitchen and bedroom, to catch her if she did anything to the vitamins or Rebecca's food. Catherine had a private investigator she worked with who could install small wireless cameras that would record continuously to cloud storage and would be virtually impossible for Patricia to detect. The cameras were technically legal since Rebecca had a right to record what happened in her own home, and footage of Patricia tampering with the vitamins or food would be powerful evidence of intentional poisoning. Third, Rebecca needed to start keeping a detailed daily journal documenting every symptom she experienced, every dose of vitamins she supposedly took, every interaction with Patricia, and every medical appointment or treatment she underwent. This journal would establish a clear pattern and timeline that corroborated the other evidence and would help Rebecca remember specific details when she eventually had to testify. Catherine emphasized that the journal needed to be factual and unemotional, rather than speculative or accusatory, simply recording observable facts that could be verified through other means. Fourth, Catherine wanted to investigate Patricia's background more thoroughly to see if there was any history of similar behavior or any evidence that Patricia had purchased or possessed the poisons found in Rebecca's capsules. Catherine explained that in cases like this, The perpetrator was rarely acting for the first time. That someone with the knowledge and willingness to carry out a sophisticated months-long poisoning had likely either done it before or had been planning it meticulously. If they could find evidence of prior victims or proof that Patricia had acquired the specific poisons, it would devastate any claim that the poisoning was accidental or that Patricia had been innocently providing supplements she believed were helpful. Finally, and most importantly, Catherine said Rebecca needed to continue pretending to take the vitamins while actually disposing of them, and she needed to act as sick as she had been so that Patricia wouldn't suspect any Liestring had changed. If Patricia realized Rebecca had discovered the poisoning, she would likely destroy evidence, flee, or potentially escalate to more immediate violence. The investigation needed to happen quietly and quickly while Patricia still believed her plan was working, and while Rebecca had the element of surprise. Rebecca had her blood drawn the next day, at a forensic lab Catherine recommended, and the results showed catastrophically high levels of thallium and arsenic in her system, far beyond anything that could be explained by environmental exposure. Her hair analysis showed the same, with a timeline pattern that corresponded exactly to when she had started taking the vitamins. This was concrete proof she had been poisoned, and the levels were high enough that the forensic toxicologist said she was lucky to be alive, that, if she had continued being poisoned, she would likely have died within another month or two from organ failure or neurological damage. The hidden cameras were installed by a professional investigator that Catherine recommended. They were tiny wireless cameras disguised as phone chargers and smoke detectors, and they recorded continuously to a cloud storage system that only Rebecca and Catherine could access. For 3 days, nothing happened on the cameras except Patricia coming and going, cleaning, and being present in their home. But on the 4th day, the cameras captured something damning. Patricia was in the kitchen making Rebecca lunch, while Daniel was at work and Rebecca was supposedly sleeping. Patricia took Rebecca's vitamin bottle from the kitchen counter, where it was kept, opened it, dumped all the remaining capsules into the garbage disposal, and ran it. Then refilled the bottle from an unmarked container she pulled from her large purse. She shook the bottle to settle the capsules, wiped her fingerprints off with a dish towel, and placed it back on the counter exactly where it had been. This video evidence was exactly what they needed. But Catherine advised waiting to confront Patricia until they had even more evidence if possible, particularly proof of where Patricia was getting the poisons. Catherine hired a private investigator to follow Patricia and investigate her background, and what they discovered was even more disturbing than Rebecca had imagined. Patricia had been married before Daniel's father, briefly in her 20s, to a man named Robert Carlson, who had died mysteriously at age 28 of what was ruled at the time as a sudden cardiac event. The private investigator found old newspaper articles about his death and about his young widow, who had inherited his life insurance policy and small estate. Then Patricia had married Daniel's father 3 years later, and he had become mysteriously disabled with progressive neurological symptoms at age 45, symptoms that doctors had never been able to fully explain, but that had left him essentially bedridden in a nursing facility for the past 20 years. The investigator also discovered that Patricia had recently purchased large quantities of rat poison from multiple hardware stores under fake names, and that she had a storage unit they hadn't known about where she kept boxes of supplements, empty vitamin bottles, and a label-making machine. When Catherine petitioned for a search warrant, based on this evidence combined with Rebecca's medical records, the security footage, and the lab results, a judge issued one immediately. The police searched Patricia's house, her car, and her storage unit all on the same day, with Rebecca and Daniel present at Patricia's house, when the police arrived with the warrant. The look on Patricia's face when the police walked in was something Rebecca would never forget, and would sometimes still see in nightmares years later. Patricia had been in her kitchen making her famous pot roast that she had prepared countless times for Sunday dinners, wearing a cheerful floral apron and looking like everyone's perfect grandmother with her styled silver hair and pearl earrings. And then suddenly, there were 6 uniformed police officers and 2 plainclothes detectives walking through her immaculate home with an official search warrant and stacks of evidence collection bags. Daniel was completely confused and kept asking what was happening, looking from the police to his mother to Rebecca for explanation, his voice rising in panic as he tried to make sense of the invasion. But Rebecca just stood there silently with her mother, Margaret beside her holding her hand tightly, and she watched Patricia's carefully maintained mask finally slip for just a few seconds. For just that brief moment, maybe 3 or 4 seconds at most, Patricia looked directly at Rebecca with such pure concentrated hatred that it made Rebecca physically step backward into her mother's arms. Patricia's eyes went completely cold and flat like a shark's eyes, and her mouth twisted into an expression of such rage and malice that she looked like a completely different person, someone Rebecca had never seen before, despite 7 years of knowing her. Then just as quickly, Patricia's face rearranged itself into an expression of confused victimhood, her eyes going wide and innocent, her hands fluttering to her chest in theatrical shock. Her voice trembling as she asked what this was all about, and insisted there must be some terrible mistake. The transformation happened so fast that Rebecca almost questioned whether she had really seen that flash of murderous hatred, but her mother had seen it too and squeezed Rebecca's hand tightly in acknowledgement. Detective Sarah Chen, the lead investigator on the case, calmly explained to Patricia that they had a warrant to search the premises for evidence related to the attempted murder of Rebecca Martinez Harris through deliberate poisoning with toxic substances. Patricia's performance of shock and innocence was actually quite convincing, as she clutched at her apron and insisted that this was impossible, that she would never hurt Rebecca, who was like a daughter to her, that she had only been trying to help Rebecca get pregnant with vitamins from a naturopath, that there had obviously been some terrible misunderstanding. Daniel immediately moved to his mother's side, putting his arm around her protectively, and he turned to Rebecca with a look of betrayal and demanded to know what lies she had told the police about his mother. The police search was methodical and thorough, taking almost 4 hours to complete. Officers photographed every room, collected samples from the kitchen including food, spices, and containers, bagged Patricia's purse and its contents including the unmarked vitamin bottle they found inside, and took Patricia's computer and phone for forensic analysis. The real evidence came from Patricia's bedroom, where officers found a locked filing cabinet that they had to break open. Inside were bank statements showing purchases from chemical supply companies, printed instructions for extracting arsenic from rat poison and administering thallium, medical articles about the symptoms of heavy metal poisoning, and most damning, several bottles of pure thallium sulfate and arsenic trioxide that Patricia had apparently acquired from laboratory supply companies using false credentials. But the storage unit search happening simultaneously was where the truly devastating evidence was found. The private investigator, Marcus, had provided the address, and a separate team of officers had gone there with another search warrant. Inside the 10 by 10 unit, officers found dozens of boxes containing empty supplement bottles, commercial label, printing equipment with templates that matched the labels on the vitamins Patricia had given Rebecca, detailed handwritten notes about dosing schedules and expected symptoms, and multiple journals where Patricia had documented not only Rebecca's poisoning, but also her earlier poisonings of Robert Carlson and Richard Harris. The journals were written in Patricia's distinctive hand, writing that matched samples from her home, and they detailed her motivations, her methods, and her complete lack of remorse in chilling detail. The police found everything they needed within 2 hours of searching. The storage unit contained boxes and boxes of evidence, including empty thallium sulfate containers from chemical supply companies, arsenic trioxide that Patricia had apparently extracted from rat poison, detailed notes about dosages and symptoms, and most damning of all, a journal where Patricia had been documenting her poisoning of Rebecca with clinical precision. The journal entries detailed every dose Patricia had given, every symptom Rebecca had experienced, and Patricia's thoughts throughout the process. The entries revealed that Patricia had never intended for Rebecca to survive, that she viewed Rebecca as an interloper who had stolen her son and was preventing Patricia from being the most important woman in Daniel's life. The journal made it clear that Patricia had been planning to kill Rebecca slowly enough, that it would look like a tragic mystery illness, and then Patricia would be there to comfort Daniel in his grief and ensure he never remarried or left her again. The police also found evidence suggesting Patricia had poisoned her first husband Robert to death with arsenic decades earlier, and that she had been slowly poisoning Daniel's father with heavy metals over years, causing his progressive neurological disability that everyone had assumed was early onset ALS or Parkinson's disease. The depth of Patricia's psychopathy was staggering, and the fact that she had gotten away with it for so long was terrifying. Patricia was arrested that evening and charged with attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and possession of poison with intent to harm. The evidence against her was overwhelming and undeniable. Daniel was absolutely devastated, and in complete denial initially, insisting there had been a mistake, that his mother would never do something like this, that Rebecca must have misunderstood or fabricated evidence because she was jealous of his relationship with his mother. But Catherine arranged for Daniel to watch the security footage of Patricia refilling the vitamin bottle with poison, and to read portions of Patricia's journal, and something in Daniel's psyche cracked that day. He realized that his entire life had been built on a foundation of lies, that his father's disability had been caused intentionally by the woman he worshipped, that his mother was a calculating murderer who had nearly killed his wife. The trial took place 6 months later and lasted 3 weeks. Patricia's defense attorney tried to argue that she had been having a psychotic break, or that she had been confused and thought the substances were actually helpful supplements. But the prosecution presented the journal, the video evidence, Rebecca's medical records showing the poisoning, the lab results from the capsules, and testimony from the forensic toxicologist who explained exactly how the substances Patricia had used would have killed Rebecca within another few weeks. They also presented evidence about Robert Carlson's suspicious death decades earlier, and about Daniel's father's poisoning, though Patricia was not charged for those crimes due to statute of limitations issues, and the difficulty of proving them conclusively after so many years. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts, including attempted murder in the first degree, possession of poison with intent to cause death, and conspiracy to commit murder. Patricia showed no emotion whatsoever when the verdict was read by the jury foreman, maintaining a cold, dignified silence, as if the entire legal proceeding was beneath her dignity and not worth her emotional engagement. She sat perfectly still in her tailored suit, with her hands folded in her lap, her expression blank and distant, refusing to look at anyone in the courtroom, including Daniel, who was sitting behind her crying silently. At sentencing 3 weeks later, the judge gave Patricia the maximum sentence allowed under state law of 35 years in prison, without any possibility of parole, for at least 25 years, meaning Patricia would be 93 years old before she could even apply for parole consideration. The judge stated from the bench that Patricia had demonstrated extreme cruelty, premeditation, and a complete lack of remorse, and that she posed a danger to society, particularly to family members of anyone she felt threatened by. The resolution was as complete as Rebecca could have hoped for. Patricia was in prison and would likely die there. Daniel's father was removed from the nursing facility, where Patricia had maintained control over his care, and he was placed in a new facility where he began receiving proper treatment without Patricia having any access to him. Remarkably, with intensive medical care and detoxification, Daniel's father showed slight improvement in his neurological symptoms, confirming that Patricia had likely been continuing to poison him, even in the nursing facility, through food and drinks she brought during visits. Rebecca underwent intensive detoxification treatment and worked with specialists to repair the damage the heavy metal poisoning had caused to her nervous system and organs. It took almost a full year, but she gradually recovered most of her cognitive function. Her tremors resolved, her hair grew back, and she regained her strength. She was able to return to nursing eventually, though she chose to work in a different specialty in a clinic setting rather than returning to the high-stress environment of the cardiac ICU. The physical recovery was easier than the emotional recovery, and Rebecca spent years in therapy, processing the betrayal and trauma of having been systematically poisoned by someone who claimed to love her. Her marriage to Daniel survived, but was fundamentally changed. Daniel had to reckon with the fact that his entire childhood and young adulthood had been manipulated by a psychopath, that his father's disability had been intentional rather than a tragic medical event, that his mother had murdered his mother's first husband and had nearly murdered his wife. He went through intensive therapy and supported Rebecca throughout her recovery, but the betrayal and guilt weighed on him. They decided not to have children together, both feeling that the trauma had changed their priorities, and neither wanting to bring a child into a family with such darkness in its history. Rebecca also received a substantial financial settlement from Patricia's assets, including the house in Queen Anne, that was sold to pay restitution. The settlement didn't erase what had happened, but it allowed Rebecca to take time off work for recovery and to ensure she had financial security for her future. Patricia's sister, who had been estranged from Patricia for decades, came forward after the trial with her own stories of abuse and suspicious incidents involving Patricia, validating that Patricia's psychopathy had been present throughout her entire life. Looking back now, 5 years after the poisoning was discovered, Rebecca has built a new life that feels authentic and safe. She advocates for awareness about medical abuse and poisoning, particularly by family members, which is far more common than most people realize but is often dismissed or misdiagnosed by medical professionals. She shares her story publicly to help other people recognize the warning signs of being poisoned, including the subtle changes in health that mimic other conditions, the isolation tactics that abusers use, and the importance of trusting your instincts when something feels wrong, even if everyone around you insists you're being paranoid or ungrateful. Rebecca learned that trust must be earned and maintained, not automatically granted because of family relationships or social roles like mother-in-law. She learned that kindness can be a weapon when wielded by someone with malicious intent, and that sometimes the most dangerous people are those who appear most caring and helpful on the surface. She learned that boundary setting is not selfish, but essential for survival, and that anyone who punishes you for setting boundaries is showing you exactly who they are. The experience taught Rebecca about human capacity for both cruelty and resilience. Patricia's actions were evil in a calculated, systematic way that still sometimes keeps Rebecca awake at night. But Rebecca also witnessed her own strength in following her instincts despite being gaslit by everyone around her, in methodically gathering evidence despite being physically and cognitively impaired by the poisoning, and in rebuilding her life from the devastation Patricia had caused. She found unexpected allies in her mother, who flew across the country immediately to help, in Catherine Morrison, the attorney who believed her, when she had barely physical evidence, in Dr. Chen, the lab technician, who asked no judging questions, and in the medical professionals who finally took her seriously when she had proof of poisoning. If Rebecca could tell others anything from her experience, it would be to trust your body and your instincts when something feels wrong. Even if medical tests come back normal, and even if people you love insist you're being irrational, it would be to never let anyone isolate you from your support system or convince you that you owe them access to your life that feels uncomfortable. It would be to understand that anyone who uses guilt and obligation to control you is not actually acting out of love, regardless of what they claim or how they present themselves. It would be to keep evidence and documentation when you suspect something is wrong. Because without that paper trail and physical proof, abusers often convince everyone that their victims are unreliable or crazy. Rebecca also wants people to understand that poisoning by intimate partners or family members is far more common than most realize, accounting for thousands of cases annually in the United States alone that are often misdiagnosed as mysterious illnesses or psychosomatic conditions or chronic fatigue syndrome or any number of other vague diagnoses that don't require specific causation. The symptoms of heavy metal poisoning like thallium and arsenic mimic dozens of other conditions, including autoimmune diseases such as lupus or multiple sclerosis, mental illness including depression and anxiety disorders, and neurological disorders like Parkinson's disease or ALS, which allows poisoners to hide their crimes in plain sight while their victims undergo expensive medical testing that finds nothing definitive or conclusive. Many victims die or suffer permanent, irreversible damage before anyone suspects poisoning, particularly when the poisoner is someone trusted and respected, like a spouse, parent, or caregiver who has regular unsupervised access to the victim's food and medications, and who can control the narrative about the victim's declining health. Medical professionals are generally not trained to suspect poisoning unless there is an obvious acute exposure, or unless someone explicitly raises the possibility, which means chronic low-level poisoning can continue undetected for months or even years. The justice Rebecca received was more complete than most poisoning victims experience, largely because she was able to gather such comprehensive evidence before confronting Patricia. Many victims who suspect poisoning go to the police without sufficient proof, and cases get dismissed or never prosecuted because of the difficulty of proving intentional poisoning versus accidental exposure or medical conditions. Rebecca's security footage, showing Patricia deliberately switching the vitamins, combined with the lab evidence proving what was in the capsules, Rebecca's forensic medical evidence showing she had been poisoned, and Patricia's incriminating journal, created an unshakable case that resulted in conviction and a lengthy sentence. 5 years later, Rebecca has no contact with Patricia and has made peace with the likelihood that Patricia will die in prison without ever showing genuine remorse or acknowledging the full extent of her crimes. Patricia maintains her innocence and has never explained why she kept such detailed journals if she was truly innocent, why she had storage units full of poisons and empty vitamin bottles, or why the video clearly shows her switching Rebecca's vitamins with substances from her purse. Patricia's delusion, or her commitment to maintaining her innocent facade, is apparently so complete that she would rather die in prison than admit what she did. Rebecca lives now in a small, comfortable house in Tacoma, with 2 rescue dogs named Luna and Bear, and has rebuilt a life centered around authenticity, safety, personal peace, and chosen family rather than obligatory family relationships or social expectations. She maintains boundaries that would once have seemed harsh to her, but that she now recognizes as basic self-protection. She has friends who respect those boundaries, and a career that feels meaningful without being consuming. She occasionally speaks at medical conferences and professional training seminars about recognizing and properly investigating suspected poisoning cases. And she has helped several other poisoning victims navigate the legal and medical systems based on what she learned from her own experience. The experience changed her fundamentally, took things from her she can never get back, including years of health and vitality, and a certain innocent trust in people. But it also revealed strengths she hadn't known she possessed, and taught her what she truly values most in life, which is safety, genuine honesty, authenticity, and the courage to protect herself, even when doing so makes others uncomfortable.